You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today, I'm chatting with Lane Nieset, a journalist and specialist in luxury travel based here in France. She's here to explore that je ne sais quoi that lends such a connotation of luxury to French goods, and to see why a word that usually refers to size in the US is far more complex in France. Deluxe. All right, and welcome Lane to the podcast. Lane, thank you so much for joining me today. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do here in France?
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me. So I've been in France for about 10 years now, working as a travel freelance journalist. I initially came here teaching English to get the visa, as a lot of us do. And I was living in Nice, and I had studied journalism and was trying to figure out a way to stay, and freelancing made sense. And so I stayed in the south of France for about 6 years, and then finally made the leap here about 4 years ago. And I've been covering a lot of France, but also Europe from my base here in Paris. And I specialize in luxury, particularly with hotels, but also with some cruising, yachts, some private aviation, that whole world, which being in the south of France for so long definitely got me used to covering.
Absolutely. And I'm so excited to hear a bit about sort of what makes the conception of luxury in France and in the US so different, because I think that, there are some overlapping features, but there's also a lot that sort of stands out. And the word that I was kind of thinking of as our jumping off point is a borrowed term into English, deluxe. But in English, it often seems to mean bigger or more. And a lot of the time, that's kind of the impression that I get of like how Americans, at least a certain set of Americans, perceive luxury as like, these big McMansions, like size. Whereas in France, it seems as though deluxe or luxe luxury isn't necessarily always about size or quantity. Do you sort of get a sense of that discrepancy just sort of right off the bat? Do the French see bigger things as being more luxurious?
I think you're right. If you think of the term deluxe suite, we often use that in hotels in the US. Bigger, it's more luxurious. But here, size does not play a huge role in what's making something luxurious. It's usually those small details. It is the tailoring of a dress. It is the molding in a room. And it's really more artisanal and something that's fine, maybe a little bit rarer. Whereas in the US, we think more is more.
Yeah. And so like, if you get told, for example, as a journalist, and we get approached by PR people a lot, that something is luxurious in the US versus in France. Let's say, like, given your experience, a hotel room, when you say, oh, a luxurious stay, is there something that you're expecting to get out of that stay in the US versus France?
In the US, I'm expecting to have a lavish, over-the-top room. I'm thinking maybe even chandeliers. Like the Baccarat Hotel is a great example in New York. We don't have something of that extent here. Maybe the Peninsula could be comparable, which is catering ideally to an Asian market who's looking for that type of opulence. But in New York, you want the tall skyscraper. You want that 54th floor view. You're really looking for this wow factor that is in your face. Whereas luxury here isn't quite so black and white. I mean, often in the past, in the south of France, for example, in villages like Grasse, the wealth was hidden. You couldn't see from the exterior who had that wealth, who was wealthy. It was once you entered inside, then you could see it in the furnishings and the carpet, and that was all to protect everyone's image and also on the street so no one could tell who was who. It's changing now, of course, but I still think in Paris, people live much more modestly. You don't see that luxury so much, but you see it in the service. You see how everyone knows your name right away, how they quickly know your preferences, the coffee in the morning that you like, those little croissants that come in the baskets. And, that is luxury here. Whereas in the US, I think it's cost and it's more I think it's something more tangible. Luxury has to be more tangible in the US. It is the big designer bag that shows the designer. Designers here are also luxurious, but you're not often seeing the label.
That's a really interesting distinction. And I do think like in France, we often see, it's a little more uncouth to talk about money, for example. And that's something that, culturally here dates back to the revolution, right? Where like, the tiers état was trying to topple the aristocracy and we had this, egalitarian rise afterwards. There's always been, the haves and the have-nots, but I think that there's something a little more understated, like you're saying, about like, if you do have that wealth and if you do have that status, part of the luxury is in the smaller details, I guess.
I think you're seeing a difference also regionally. In Paris, luxury is a lot more understated than in the south of France, for example. You're obviously seeing in places like Monaco and Cannes, you're seeing that luxury on display a lot more than you'd be seeing it here. Even the way people are dressing, they're dressing up a lot more. Here in Paris, you don't see people dressing up so much to go out to dinner. It's that understated elegance. They look put together. You know that they're someone who maybe works in a certain field or is in the luxury realm, but it's not as apparent.
I think that one thing I've noticed a lot here in Paris, where we both live, or even elsewhere, is that the French tend to embrace things that we as Americans might consider to be luxuries that are for a special occasion, like flowers, like fresh flowers, or, artisanal chocolates, things that even champagne, I think, things that we think of in the States as having, maybe once, twice a year on like New Year's or like a big birthday or Christmas, that are sort of folded into the French way of living. I would say not entirely regardless of your socioeconomic position, but there are small luxuries that seem to be more affordable or available. Do you get that impression in France?
I do. I think that it's part of the fabric of the community. You know your butcher, you know your baker, you know your florist, and you make that effort to, it's an indulgence in a way, but also weave it into your everyday life where if you're going to have that steak, you want to have a good quality steak from the butcher next door. The same with flowers. You want that fresh feel. You want something in your home that's going to brighten it up. It's not just for a special occasion, although you often bring flowers to an event, a party, a dinner as a gesture for the host there. But I think that the French enjoy what I see it as little luxuries because although it's been a decade, to me, it's still considered, it's not quite as the norm for me. But these little luxuries of if you're going to be doing something, do it right. Whether it's flowers, whether it's cooking, whether it's going to a restaurant, everything they're trying to do, they want to do it intentionally.
And do you think that has a part to play in the fact that, when we perceive the French in the US, using a French word like deluxe or like chic, we have this connotation like that anytime anything is French, it must be a little bit luxurious. Why do you think we make that association so readily and so easily in the Anglophone world?
It's interesting. I get this a lot with beauty because everyone wants to be as effortlessly chic as the French woman with, the flawless makeup, where they're wearing it, but you can't tell that they're wearing it. And I'm not sure exactly what caused people to put the French in such a pedestal, but I do think it is the attention to detail, and that's where the luxury comes in. And you can still see it in the community. There are shops that are dedicated to one thing. You have your fromagerie, your patisserie, your boulangerie, your poissonnerie. You have all of these places that do one thing really well. And I think that's also why the Japanese culture is very similar to the French, because they do specialize in that one thing, that one shop that has been there for a while. Here in France, you will have generations of people that have run this one particular shop, and they are so excellent at what they do, and that's what's luxurious about it. I mean, Poilâne is a great example. Generations of bakers, and they just keep improving, and that's luxury. going to pull out and having one of their beautiful breads that's luxury. And you see it because of the fabric of the community that they've built around that bakery. I think in the US, it's a bit more fleeting. I think that the size, once again, comes into play. We think if it's bigger, it's going to be better. Whereas here, that's not necessarily true. I think often, especially with food, if something is that much bigger, we tend to think that they're covering up. Why is it so big? If it's that great, we don't need a lot of it. We just want enough to have that taste to sample it.
That's such a good point. I think, you see that like with a steak is a really good example where, portion sizes here tend to be much smaller. You get maybe like 4 ounces of a really incredible steak rather than having like this ribeye hanging off your plate as a sign of, a luxury thing. And we're definitely seeing that coming into the US too. But, I think it does seem that less is more in France in terms of luxury.
Yeah, and I think that the culture, they go as far as to protect, and there's designated areas, for example, for the cheeses, for Roquefort, for Champagne, they really want to protect these cultural, whether it's the food culture, whether it is a specific specialty of that region, they go really far to protect that identity.
And the comparison that you made with Japan feels really apt as well, because, that perfecting of, one beautiful cantaloupe, or, you see them in the markets in Japan, and, it's wrapped in a ribbon and it's in a box, and it's expensive, but people understand the value of something like that, or, the Wagyu beef. Whereas in France, we have these products that have become synonymous with luxury around the world: champagne, Perigord truffles, foie gras, and then obviously outside of the food realm, designers like Chanel and jewelers. Do you think there's something uniquely French that makes those products so synonymous with luxury, or do you think that are we conflating everything French with a sense of luxury, or is there an underlying craftsmanship that means that luxury perception when it comes to these French products is really, I would say in major scare quotes, like earned?
I think it's a mix of the two. I think you have couture that really launched this fashion element with, Paris being this fashion capital. And that's, once again, craftsmanship that has obviously evolved. And it's become, Paris is still seen as a fashion capital, but I don't think necessarily it's relating to the craftsmanship anymore. Although you have wonderful designers who are doing beautiful things, I think now we tend to lump everything together as Parisian being chic. And in terms of luxury, the products, I think that they carry this weight. Truffles, champagne, artisanal chocolates, they do have this feeling of being indulgent, decadent. Champagne, you don't need to wait for New Year's to have it here. You can have it throughout the year. It is much more affordable, though, as opposed to exporting it to other places. In the US, you're paying a bit more. Maybe that's what's causing it to seem as more of a luxury good, as opposed to, I wouldn't say it's an everyday good here, depending on your life.
Right, yeah.
But, wine can be a daily luxury here. You can have a nice bottle of wine, and it doesn't have to cost 50 euros. It can cost 15 euros and still be a very well-made quality bottle of wine.
Yeah, I think that is an essential piece of the puzzle that sometimes seems, obviously, yeah, people aren't necessarily breaking out their best champagne every night of the week, but I've spoken with, champagne producers, as I'm sure you have, who say, it's a wine first and foremost. And, you don't need to wait until New Year's Eve to drink champagne. You can drink it, on a special, you're having a dinner party and you're like, yeah, let's have some champagne, with our cheese course, or as an aperitif or with dessert. You can serve it without having to wait for a crazy occasion, I guess. If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Storytime in Paris, where each week host Jennifer interviews a different author about his or her book set in Paris or France. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French.
And I think, too, with the culture here, it's less about the labels. It's more about the story behind a product or an experience, Whereas in the US, you would look at that label, see it's French, and then that would give an impression of what that product is going to be. And often luxury is the impression that you're getting. Whereas here, often it's the story. It's how they came across this bottle. They met that producer, or they were in this region and picked up this wonderful product that they wanted to share with their friends. It's really much more of a communal spirit that's built on stories of these different experiences. It's less about having this big new thing. When the new iPhones come out, people don't rush to get them here. People aren't lining up at Apple for the latest iPhone. Whereas in the US, there's a bragging rights associated with, that is a luxury. That's $1,000 phone. So I think it's less about that here and more about, waiting for the right moment. I think patience is a big part of it. With patience, it's also taking that step back and not rushing through anything. And that's the luxury. Coffee to go is such a new concept in France. When I was here 10 years ago, if you could find an espresso machine at your local boulangerie, when you're on your way to work, you're like, oh, finally, I have some coffee for the day. Slowly, it started changing. Starbucks came in, McDonald's, they brought in a cafe component. And now you have the Scandinavian-inspired coffee shops that will do coffee to go. But even then, most people don't want it to go. They want to take that half an hour, that 45 minutes, either with themselves or with a friend or with a colleague, and sit and catch up and really enjoy that coffee.
Yeah, and I think you've brushed up against something that I've noticed in other realms as well, in terms of like the French conception of luxury, and specifically I think also the Parisian concept of luxury as being something that has a realness to it, like an authenticity. I recently got the opportunity to interview Bertrand Grébeau, who, as you know, is the Michelin-starred chef behind Septime, and he opened a couple of years back a country sort of B&B called Junil. And he was talking about how when they came into this region of the Perche, that they started serving really fresh grown radishes with house-made butter, and that the locals were kind of like, what the hell? Like, you're a Michelin-starred chef and you come here and you're serving, simple radishes with butter and salt. But the Parisians go gaga for it because that is what seems luxurious to someone who lives in an urban center. Do you get that sense that there's that authentic? I mean, I think that's sort of coming to maybe the American perception of luxury as well. This kind of like proximity to the roots or the origins. Is that something that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and that's why the farm to table movement has had such traction over the years in the US. I think now it's embracing the locavore culture. And here too, instead of covering things up, which is part of the French gastronomy, with sauces those sauces are absolutely beautiful. Don't get me wrong. I love a good sauce. But I think now it's letting those ingredients shine, and just nice vegetables, fresh vegetables. If they're prepared very simply, but they're very fresh, local, you're going to get so much more out of that. And I think that's now what the consumer wants, and that's what's luxury.
Now, luxury has like a number of different ways that the word can be used, but in English, when we call something a luxury, I think that we have this connotation of it being out of reach or exclusive or even exclusionary. And it's kind of like this luxury idea is reinforcing the discrepancies between the haves and the have-nots. And in France, which is supposed to be, ideally meant to be, a more egalitarian society, obviously there are things that in the US we would consider luxuries, like, access to holiday or, things like that maybe are not as out of reach to the French. So do you think that sort of exclusive or exclusionary idea is still built into the word luxe or luxury in French? Or is there something else about it?
I think that in the US, the term is thrown around a lot more. I quite frankly don't hear the term luxury or deluxe here all that often. I more would hear, c'est la classe, something along those lines. Whereas I find that the American culture, it's an easy descriptor. It's easy to just slap the term luxury. And quite often it's not. But then again, luxury is really in the eyes of the beholder. It's the same as what you consider beautiful. But I find that the term is thrown around a lot. It's very similar to the term sustainability, which is a whole other topic.
Mm-hmm.
But I find that that's a really common way to say, oh, something is nice, maybe it's a little bit fancy. Whereas here, if you're thinking about the term and what could be considered luxurious or a luxury is very different. I think about vacation, I don't know if they would consider it a luxury because it's ingrained in the culture. But as a foreigner living here, I still consider myself 10 years later, I'm a foreigner. I don't have August off. I'm a freelancer. So I still, I'm on the American schedule. I am still writing all August long. And I love that. But I look at them and I think, wow, that is a luxury to take off that time. I think it's a luxury for my friends with children to have access to childcare and affordable, healthcare that is, there are so many perks of being here that I consider looking as an outsider looking in as a luxury. And I think the American market does see that as well. And what's changing now is the Americans coming here and getting the service that is also what we want out of hospitality and luxury. That I think, especially in the wake of the pandemic, the one thing we all missed was being taken care of. Obviously, when you're at a Michelin restaurant, service is half of that equation, which is what makes a Michelin meal such a luxury. Of course, the food is typically pretty extravagant, but it's also having luxury to sit for 3, 4, 5, I've had 6-hour meals, being able to sit and to linger and to enjoy and have a team acting like an orchestra, taking care of every detail and all coming together to really create this experience.
And as Americans, we can be so, wide-eyed impressed by things like that. I think, I'm a foreigner still here too after 15 years. And I think a lot of my French friends, they'll make fun of me because I think everything's amazing and awesome and wow. And, we tend to react so positively to some of the things that I feel like the French do tend to take in stride. And a lot of the the social factors that you listed are some major role pieces of that. The fact that they take for granted that they're going to have holiday or they're going to have childcare or education, things like that. Is there anything that you get the impression after having lived here among the French for so long that were the French to have a wide-eyed wow amazing reaction to something, maybe something American? Is there a luxury that we maybe take for granted as Americans that you think the French would be excited by?
I think that it's the natural beauty in the US. They often think that we're so lucky to have, the Grand Canyon, all of these parks. But also, I think that they're blown away by the flash. I always hear it's the same few places: Las Vegas, Miami, New York. For them, it's a luxury first to get to travel that far and also to experience something that is so different from what they're used to seeing, and to see that more is more lifestyle. They're like, I don't know if it's embracing is the right word to say, but they do love that's indulging for them. That's
Mm-hmm.
indulging. They want to go, they want to go to just a really cool, trendy fast food joint. They want to go to a Shake Shack. They've seen these things in movies. For them, it's built up in American media. And so when they get to go, it's a luxury for them to get to even be there. And then to try these things that they've read or seen or, heard so much about. Which for us, once again, that's pretty commonplace, but for them, it's super exciting. It's a treat.
Yeah, I think you've definitely put your finger on something massive here that we're even seeing now in the trends in food in Paris. I think a lot of people who come over from the States are surprised to find that, we have American cookies, and we have American burgers and American donuts. And, the French love using words, like they say, ah, c'est trop fat. Like it's big and hearty and cheesy and crazy and not at all what we used to associate with luxurious French food. But that more is more mentality coming over from the US is definitely becoming more of a thing. I think you're right.
Yeah, but I do think that everything the French have this really Americans do see this very classic side of France, and that comes down to the purity of just the cheeses, things like that. And that's the one thing that I think France has in terms of luxury that is why so many things are exported and considered to be a delicacy. It's the foie, it's the cheese, things that we've mentioned that let's use the American market as an example. Americans coming here, the first thing they all want to do is they want to get a pastry or a croissant and cheese.
Yeah.
And then they're happy they want to have that every day. I think that's why the cheese cart, the cheese trolley remains to be such a fixture in some of these older school establishments. They want to see that ceremony preparing a cheese plate, which if you go to your local fromagerie, they will do a smaller scale version of that if you're having an event or want something for your home. But I think for Americans coming here, that's a luxury. And it's pretty simple and it's pretty attainable.
Yeah, absolutely. Lane, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. I really enjoyed hearing your perspective. I have one last question for you before I let you go, and that is, what is your favorite word in French?
Oh my gosh, my favorite word in French. That's a hard one. I think gourmand is a really good word.
Ooh, that is a good one. Oh, I like that one.
Yeah. I mean, it's a little hard to translate it properly, but I think anywhere you're at, you still get the idea, the sentiment behind that one. And
Yeah.
it encompasses so much of the French lifestyle and behavior and mentality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for folks who don't know that one, GOURMAND. And I think that might have to be a future episode of the podcast. Thank you for the inspiration.
You're welcome.
Where can folks find you? Where can folks read your stuff?
Yeah, I have a website, lanenieset.com. I'm also on Instagram, and I contribute to mostly American publications, Travel and Leisure, Condé Nast Traveler, Thrillist, and I am a guidebook author for Inside Paris with Voters.
Amazing. And we will throw links to all of that in the description in the show notes. Thanks again, Lane, so much for joining me, and have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thanks so much, you too. Bye.
Bye. This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.